Hello, listeners. My name's Chris.
My name's David.
And we are the Religious Studies Project, where the days are getting lighter here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's wonderful. I already feel like it's the summer. I realize that we're recording this a little bit in advance of it going out. We could be in the middle of blizzard conditions in Edinburgh in January. Who knows? But welcome. This week's interview has been recorded by David, speaking with Naomi Goldenberg. It's her second podcast appearance. She was in our first year speaking to Jonathan Tuckett about religion as vestigial states. And she spoke with David in Belfast in September about religion as a tactic of governance, something that is of critical interest to the RSP. Take it away, David.
We're in Belfast at the BASR Conference 2018, and I am privileged to be joined today by our keynote speaker from last night, Naomi Goldenberg of the University of Ottawa. Welcome to the Religious Studies Project, a return visit, Naomi.
Thank you.
We're going to pick up where the keynote started last night for everybody who couldn't be here for what was an excellent session. I'm thinking of where to start our conversation today. And so the idea was, as I understood it, the idea of religion as a separate sphere, separate categories projected onto the past for strategic purposes. Tell us what you mean by that, and especially this idea of strategic purposes as a tactic. What are we talking about here?
Religion is a modern category, the way I see it. Not just the way I see it, the way many scholars see it. And not just the way we see it. It can be demonstrated that the term as meaning some kind of special, separate sphere of human activity is a very, very recent idea. I'll say maybe try to explain this in terms of probably the most effective sentence that I've ever come across to explain it, is that there is no religion in the Bible. And last night I began with a passage from Deuteronomy to illustrate that you do have God in the Bible, you have all kinds of people that we identify with the category of religion now. But all of these figures were involved in government, not in anything separate that we could hive off and call religion. God was some kind of, conceived of some kind of monarch, some kind of director, someone who human beings could claim to speak for, but we get God as a principle of government. Now, of course, government is a modern term as well, so I speak about governance with lots of different words. You could say ruling authority, you could say commanding a polity, so it's a very loose concept of governance that I'm using. But this governance was, we might say now, theocratic. You don't get something separate. Clergy, that's another modern term projected onto the past, were involved with ceremonies of government. And anything that gets called religion, translated as religion in various ancient texts, tends to mean ceremonies that are related to governance. Okay, so if that's accepted, then when the modern category of religion emerges, and it emerges in fits and starts in different places and different times, slightly different times in different ways, it emerges as a way for governments to manage displaced populations, according to the theory I'm putting forward. And it's a struggle of institutions, usually always actually, between males who were running various institutions. And the loser institution evolves as a religion, or can evolve as a religion, instead of being eliminated completely, instead of the polity being banished or murdered. So you have a category that allows for a quasi-government within a larger government. And then that quasi-government derives some sort of authority from seeing itself, or perhaps truly being a government of something in the past. And the strength of that vestigial government that displaced people, that displaced sovereignty, gets to fit into the category of religion, and with that, the state grants certain status. The vestigial group is denied certain forms of violence: martial violence, police violence, violence in waiting, the violence needed to enforce court decisions. The mystification of that vestigial government occurs because of the connection with something in the past, or with the narrated idea of a government that existed in the past. The sense of religion as a strategy is that it's a strategy of dominant governments to manage this displaced or marginalized population. However, it can also be a strategy for the displaced population to claim the category, claim the mystification that surrounds the category, and put pressure on the dominant government for more rights. So it's a double kind of strategy going on.
Right, yeah. There was a great line you used in the keynote, is that religions as resting once and future governments.
Restive,
right, okay.
Restive once and future governments. Yeah, I like that phrase, once and future, sort of the once and future prince. It's a sense of the government considering itself to have been something more dominant in the past and something that will be dominant in the future. So you get that double sense of time going on, and always ambitious, even though sometimes there could be long periods when you don't see the ambition to aggrandize, to get more and more power, to have more and more spheres that can be controlled.
When we had it wasn't our conversation, but the previous religious studies project conversation, when we talked about religion as vestigial states, this seems to build a little bit on that, or my sort of sense of religion as vestigial states was more of this group of people who consider themselves a sort of restive once and future government.
I don't think often they don't consciously think of themselves
not consciously,
that way.
But that's the way it's working. But this seems to broaden it out and actually look at it the other way around as well, in the way that this can be something that's very useful for the majority state.
Oh, yes, very useful, because the majority state can claim, sometimes depending on the relationships with vestigial one, that it is supported by the vestigial older government, more mystified government. And we see that in the United States with slogans such as "In God We Trust," with having clergy open up governmental ceremonies, the closeness of government and the church in so many places.
And literally in the UK, you know.
Oh, very literally,
literally,
in the UK.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so, mystification, obviously, I mean, we have if you want to listen to our interview with Tim Fitzgerald on mystification, if you're unclear on that, basically that this is a technique by which power relations are obscured and concealed.
And also the nature of something, such as religion as a form of government, a form of rules, a form of law, regulation, ritual, ceremony, that is very like government, like what we're considering government, is obscured by the mystification. So that's not seen. It's supposed to be something mysterious.
There was something that immediately struck me during this conversation. It's always been of interest to me. We were talking about the fact that people who study religions in the classical world, for instance, don't really talk to RS people. There isn't really a great deal of, interdisciplinary work on those kind of areas. And it's always seemed to me that what we talk about as being religion in, say, the Roman Empire or Egypt or Greece or something is much more like the kind of statecraft that we do.
Exactly.
So it's much more akin to, the American civil religion stuff that you were talking about, that Robert Bella and people like that used to talk about.
I think that approaches what I'm saying, but then
But theoretically, it's the other way round.
That's right.
And that's what I find very interesting about that.
Yeah. Good.
So rather than saying, this modern statecraft is a bit like some kinds of religion. Actually, we could flip that and we can say, well, we don't think of this as religion. So why are we imposing that idea on states from 2,000 years ago? Why do we use the category religion to talk about the polis and the Olympic Games and these kind of things in Rome? Is this part of this, this tactic of managing?
I'm not sure it's part of the tactic of management, although it might be, because it gives the vestigial government a lot of power and a lot of mystery and a lot of emotional valence. And then when the dominant government relies on the vestigial government, hearkens back to it, that it also gains that kind of power.
This fundamentally, I think, changes that conversation. So we had in the sort of sociology of religion, in the classic kind of 1960s sociology of religion, we had this idea of quasi-religions or state religions or civil religion. But this actually changes that conversation, because now we could actually say, well, if that's religion, then, why do we have to call that religion? We could just not call it religion. We could just call it statecraft.
You could call it statecraft, exactly.
I think it might be useful for the listener to have a couple of examples. And there was a few interesting examples.
I'd like to say one thing about that. I think the mystification of something in the past that we can say is religion and is eternal comes from, in some ways, world religions discourse.
Right, yes.
And I think it works the way world religions as a category, although there's a lot of argument about when that starts exactly. Some trace it back to mid-1600s, whatever, when Christians discovered that there were other peoples in the world who actually didn't know anything about Christianity. And then various scholars have shown that when these new to the Europeans areas were discovered, one of the first things that explorers say is that, there's no religion here. These people are primitive. There's nothing. And then after the explorers are there for a while, they begin to notice something that might be, that could be a primitive form of religion. And guess what it is? It's a beginning, and Christianity is the evolution, the apotheosis, the pinnacle of this development. So the fact that there is this thing we can identify maybe as a thing and call religion, could be anything, could be ancestor reverence, it could be rituals at tables, it could be anything, it could be ghosts, spirits, whatever, gets named religion and then gets projected onto the past as a justification for the presence of Christian religion now. So I think that some of that is there, but as an inferior form or as another form.
I think it might be useful for the listeners to have an example. I think it's quite a clear one. I know this isn't particularly your original work, but I think it's a very good case study, and that to look at Judaism.
Yes.
And the way that we see that moving, through a number of different ways of being interpreted until we end up with, Judaism as a
or as some people say, many Judaisms. That there are scholars who trace this rather specifically, is that you didn't have anything that could be called a religion. You just had people who lived in a given area. And as these people were conquered by a succession of empires, if those who weren't killed cohered or were allowed by some governments, you could look at the way Cyrus dealt with we could call the Jewish people, is that he allowed them to have certain rituals, certain places, rebuild a temple, but a temple in the sense of like a city hall, because temples in the past weren't separated with what we'd call worship now. They were places of commercial exchange. There were law courts. There were lots of things going on. So by creating this separate space or this area, governments at that point were creating what gets now called religion.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
There were also a lot to do with food practices. Again, this is another example of reading religion into the past. So we go, oh, they were involved in sacrifices or, ritual preparations of meat. But the idea that these are religious practices is again something that
something that develops later.
We read into the past. But we can think, well, it's just the reason that, Scottish people like to eat white bread and would go to a shop that sells the only white bread from Scotland when they go to live in Canada or something like that.
That's right. And if you made, at certain points, you could make the Scots into a religion. It could be that kind of category. So whatever the Jewish people did became cohered as Judaism. As I was speaking last night about how it's true in the case of Jewish people that you have a confusion. Is this a religion? Is this an ethnicity? Is this a nation? This is all together? Is it a culture? And I think that underlies actually all polities that take on that category, that there's a lot of ambiguity there, that belief is maybe one factor and not a very important factor at all.
And there are quite strong arguments that, Judaism, the idea of a religion, is quite a late development, and they were seen historically much more often as a race than they were as a religion.
Which is another problematic.
Which is a whole other can of worms. Exactly. But the point is that there's different categories.
All coming from the idea that to be a Christian you have to believe something. So gradually, I see a change in Jewish people. Many Jews now think that you have to believe something to be really Jewish. You should never have to believe anything. You were born of a Jewish mother, or you're part of the community that made you Jewish.
Well, then it's belief. That's belief in a very Christian sense.
Exactly.
Of a credo, stated belief. This is what I believe.
Yeah.
I know it doesn't make sense to everyone, but I'm committed to it in some way. Yeah.
So that you have to worry, if you stop believing that, do you fall out of your Christianness in some way? And Jews never had to worry about that.
You also made a really good point. It was quite quick in the presentation about the way that this, in terms of like Islamist and terms like this, where people seem to be reluctant to use the term
religion. Well, the key factor there is that when a group in contemporary times does something violent, martial violence or police violence particularly, that isn't authorized by the state, then the title of religion becomes problematic, because the key thing for creating the vestigial government is that it will not have any kind of forms of violence that could challenge the state. So Max Weber said that a long time ago, not about the category of religion, but that legalized violence is the one thing that the state always holds on to for itself. So it's the one thing that isn't generally franchised out to religious groups. Of course, in when we get to the sphere of sex and gender, those are the kinds of jurisdictions that are sometimes ceded by the dominant state to the vestigial one, and you would have family courts that are authorized by the state in some countries, family courts run by quote-unquote religious authorities who would be able to decide.
And why is that different? Why, say, for instance, circumcision practices? Why is that form of violence allowable and not others?
For some reason, I think it's it's a vestige of male authority over women that both the state and the dominant state and the vestigial one claim, but somehow the state is more willing to give that jurisdiction, which I suppose was not seen as all that important, over to vestigial authorities.
Perhaps it's a situation where it benefits the state, but it slightly clashes with stated aims. So by sort of allowing, we'll just turn a blind eye to these, religions, vestigial states doing it, suits us in the long run because it restates sort of male, patriarchy.
Male dominance and supports male dominance. It's another point I was making, that the male dominance of the vestigial state, which is generally always the case, it's always male, partially because it's harkening back to something in the past, which was, well, in recorded history, seems to be male governance all of the time. I think you're right. It reinforces male dominance. But it's quite frightening because women and children become subjects of two governments, the dominant one and the vestigial one.
And male children to some degree as well.
Male children to the same degree because we let, in so many countries,
instance,
circumcision and then some oral suction. In some Jewish communities, female circumcision, and other kinds of communities, it's a very contested practice, but there's a lot of argument that it should be allowed in some degree, in some way. We allow that as a form of violence because it's supposedly religious violence.
Yes.
Or it's not seen as violence.
And of course, we have so many cases where the religious nature of a practice or a belief or some sort of prejudice comes down to whether it is or not religious. Use of cannabis by Rastafarians. There was a recent case in Scotland where a guy who claimed he'd been fired from his job for being a nationalist. He was campaigning as an SNP, and it was seen to clash with his government job. In the preliminary ruling, the judge said, well, this is a sincere and worked out belief system about the world. So it's equivalent to a religion and therefore should be protected, right? So,
and that's an example of how that category can be anything, that anything can get into it. Sometimes I talk about religion as a category in which nothing has ever been excluded. I can't get anyone to name one thing that hasn't been included in the category of religion. Impossible to exclude anything from it. And yet it's supposed to be something unique.
Yeah. It's sui generis and unique to itself, but it's also everything.
It's also everything.
It's just humans.
It shows the problematic nature of that category.
Another interesting example, I think, which shows the sort of the edges of this, is how often new religious movements dream of governments.
Exactly.
They dream of alternative governments, but they're also the target of government ire and often violence.
Well, governments are always a little bit edgy about the things they authorize as religions because they're worried about takeover, because there's a sense of competition somewhere. And new religious movements tend to imagine the government, the better government to come, could be something local that they'll enact in a certain place in a certain way. But it could also be something in the future. It could be after death. Sometimes major dominant religions, or what we call world religions, also imagine things like that. Or the government will be on another planet, or it will be after an apocalypse. But it will be better, whatever it is, and it will be something like what already happened a while ago. I mean, in that sense of being once and future.
Yeah, I'm particularly thinking of the kind of the stuff that Crawford Gribben was talking about yesterday, of the American Redoubt, where these conservative right-wing traditionalists essentially are attempting to create little states within states where patriarchal theocracy can continue within.
Because they're worried now about women getting some kind of power in some kinds of dominant
and
states.
Atheists and non-white people and homosexuals and everything
trans people,
everything, and that is clearly harking back to a a previous kind of
or an
mode of
imagined previous
an imagined
state.
previous.
Often an imagined previous. Make America Great Again is like that kind
Again,
of slogan.
you know,
Yeah, exactly.
Which one are you talking about? The McCarthy era, World War II? I mean, what is it? Civil War? Who knows? The violence aspect of it, I think, is particularly interesting. And we were riffing last night about, you know, the idea of my colleague Chris Cotter was talking about how you know, a child can be raised in a state and told that he's going to, you know, he's working for Queen country, and then signs up and goes off to another country and kills people. And because this is for the state, this is the violence is, and you'd made this point about the violence being the thing that states,
dominant states keep to themselves.
The one thing they keep to themselves. Now you have, there was another line in the keynote which I want you to unpick a bit for me. And, you know, it's religion, the category religion as an alternative to genocide.
I was suggesting, taking from Deuteronomy 20 verses 16 through 18, in which the Lord God commands a complete eradication of every living thing, people, livestock, everything, in an area that is being given as an inheritance to a population. And I was thinking that if the category of religion had been invented, this is hypothetical very much, almost like a game, to imagine that this could have been an alternative for that Lord your God, that dominant tyrant, so that he wouldn't have to kill everybody there. He could create a religion in which all forms of violence would be forbidden to that group, and perhaps the group could endure. So I was thinking of it as, which I think it has functioned that way, as an alternative to genocide. Cyrus, for example, didn't eliminate the Jews who were in his area of jurisdiction. He allowed them a space, a bounded space. That's a two-edged sword in a way, because by creating a special group with some kinds of status, sometimes that group can also then be targeted for genocide later on, the way Jews have been, the way many minorities have. So it's a double-edged thing. It's the creation of a polity with a certain kind of regulatory apparatus internal to that polity that can also make it a target.
I'd like to wrap up then with any of us who are working in the critical religion paradigm, you know, broadly stated, will eventually be angrily demanded of us what the practical application of what we're doing is, and how does it matter to real people. There are some quite clear practical examples here, and you mentioned the way the journalistic covering of the abortion debate, for instance.
Right. In Ireland, I thought that was an example, at least the newspapers I read. I was collecting articles from the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Guardian, about the abortion referendum in Ireland, the recent one. And what was done in most of those articles is that the Catholic Church was spoken about, not religion as a general category. Sometimes it was mentioned, but it was clear that this is a specific institution with specific ideologies. Someone mentioned last night that evangelical Christians were also involved, but then there's a specificity about who exactly is advocating what and for what purpose, and who exactly wins and loses in these various debates. And I think that's an important demystification of issues. So I would urge scholars in religious studies to be as specific as possible, to name the groups as specifically as you can. Are you talking about Jews? Are you talking about Muslims? Are you talking about Christians? Maybe which kind of Christians? Buddhists? Not this blanket category. That's already a step forward. I also think that a practical application, and this is, I think, where my heart is in pushing the project forward, is to demystify the category of religion so that governments can't use it to fudge so much, that it doesn't get to be such a vague category that anything can be claimed as a right within it, and that restrictions can't be put on it, and that special male privilege can't be so easily granted. These vestigial governments have just as much contingency, just as much conflict within polities as any other kinds of government. And so often they're tended to be seen as monolithic, as homogeneous, and the men who claim to represent them are given a lot of power. So because religion as a category is put into constitutions, it's put into law, I think and because no one knows what it is, courts don't know how to interpret it in a kind of consistent manner, I think that it's particularly ripe for deconstruction. And I think that some very interesting clarity can be put to these debates. That would be an example of one of the practical applications.
You've brought a lot of clarity to the conversation here. I think people are going to be very intrigued to read more of your work. But unfortunately, I have the male privilege today of ending the interview. But I just want to say thanks so much for joining us.
And thank you, David.
Thank you.
And my thanks to Naomi for taking the time to record that interview with me. As I said last week, we had been looking forward to interviewing Naomi for quite some time, since we were in Bonn.
Yes.
And got to spend some time with her. She's both a lot of fun and utterly fearless, something I like in scholars. Our own Jonathan Tuckett has a little bit of that. Yeah.
That was a real pleasure. And she did the BASR and ISASR proud with her keynotes, and now hopefully a bit of that's been preserved in perpetuity on the podcast, and we're hopeful that there's going to be a journal article coming out of it as well for BASR. That's just a bit of pressure for you there, Naomi. I'm sure Suzanne will appreciate me putting that into the podcast.
Absolutely. On Thursday, come back for a response from Mark Meehand. And what do we have coming up next week, Chris?
Well, next week, I was speaking to Atko Remmel, who has been, guess I met him for the first time in 2014 in Frankfurt. We've crossed paths quite a few times since then. And every time I met up with him, we're saying, need to get you on the podcast. So I'm really glad that we managed it this time. It's a sort of broad interview about the study of religion and also the study of national identity in an Estonian context. So we've had a few of these interviews looking at specific contexts. I know we had Lithuania, we've had Peru, and we've had things on the BASR, we've had things on NASR and whatnot. So it's good to have these snapshots. But Estonia is a particularly interesting context, being sort of post-Soviet, very high levels of apparent irreligiosity and atheism, and also that being quite tied up with the national narrative. But also Tartu in Estonia is where the ISASR is this year. So we also talk a little bit about what the Estonian Association for the Study of Religion might be bringing to the table for that conference. So it was fitting that we recorded this at the 2018 ISASR in Bern, looking forward to the 2019 ISASR in Tartu.
Indeed, and of course the RSP will be in Tartu at the EASR.
Thanks to a bursary from the EASR.
Absolutely. So big thanks to all of our sponsors, including the EASR, the BASR, the NAASR, the IAHR, and the AASR.
Yeah.
Try saying that quickly 3 times.
We should just add all those letters into one big acronym.
The NAABASAAR.
Well, there's a lot of A's and R's in there, so boom.
The coffee is clearly starting to kick in. We hope if you're listening to this in the morning, enjoying your coffee, stop wasting time on the internet. Go and do some work.
But also, let's make 2019 the year that the RSP, really becomes a community. We've always been encouraging people to comment, to retweet, to post on the website, to post on the social media feeds, to riff on the podcast, to write their own responses, write something on your blog, write into us, publish with us, excerpt bits from the audio and put them into your own podcast. I don't know, let's make this the conversation that I think a lot of you listeners have been a bit shy about. So let's make 2019 that year.
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.